Hello and welcome to Newspeak, the New Culture Forum's current affairs programme. My name's Emma Webb and I'm joined today by the director of the New Culture Forum, Peter Whittle, and senior fellow Rafe Heydel-Mankoo. So let's begin this week talking about the story of Calvin Robinson's ordination, or the decision by the Church of England to not ordain him. And this has been in the press this week with some pretty nasty comments being made about Calvin by some of the bishops. What do you think, Peter?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, Calvin is a brave guy, and I'm glad that he's actually, this time around, sort of broken out into the mainstream media. It's being covered by the Times and the Telegraph and everybody. The truth of the matter is that it's been said, I know, but the Church of England is no longer, and hasn't been for quite a long time, the Tory party at prayer. I think it's actually more like the Green Party at prayer, if anything now.
Extinction Rebellion at prayer.
Yes, exactly. The thing is, it's so blatant. And some of the things that were said about why Calvin shouldn't be ordained, such as his view, this is the main thing, his view that Britain wasn't institutionally racist. And the Bishop of London, I believe it was, said, I can't quite understand, can you explain this to me? She said, as a white woman, I can tell you that the church is institutionally racist. And she said this to a mixed-raced guy. And I just thought, the lack of self-awareness, if anything else.
It seems like what she's saying is she's essentially saying to Calvin, I know that the church is institutionally racist because I'm a racist as a white woman. That's what it sounds like she's saying.
Well, yes, I think, there's been a petition set up. I think it's a pretty good idea, actually. Say, look, if you think that it's institutionally racist, then resign. Archbishop of Canterbury, Bishop of London, resign and basically fill your positions with someone from an ethnic minority. And that actually goes for all institutions, because it's interesting, isn't it? This is said by all the people at the tops of institutions, but actually, why don't they put their money where their mouth is if they really believe it? I actually don't think they really believe it.
No, I agree.
Really don't.
I mean, Alison Pearson wrote a wonderful piece in the Telegraph, and she had this wonderful quote she wrote. She said, the gospel of woke means white people telling a black person what racism is, and then crucifying him when he disagrees with them. Yeah. And I thought that really hits the nail on the head. But what gets my goat about this is the sheer hypocrisy, because the argument I gather that they're saying is that Calvin Robinson is too divisive, and that he will bring an element of division into the church. Well, excuse me, don't we already have that division on the other side, from the bishops, from the Archbishop of Canterbury? The fact is, they don't mind the division when it's on their side. And they have this arrogance, thinking that we are the educated people who've risen to high rank, therefore we know better than everybody else. And the problem here is that they somehow think by going woke, they will somehow be appealing to a wider section of the public. But they're not. The Church of England is hemorrhaging support, hemorrhaging members, because the members are far more conservative than the clergy. There are three tiers, right, in the Church of England. You have the archbishops, who are all public school boys, essentially still in the majority, who are trying their best to be hip. Then you have the Green Party at prayer, who are the clergy, the Extinction Rebellion. And then you have the laity, who still are the Tory party at prayer. And the irony is Calvin appeals to the laity, and you would think now a young black conservative person is precisely the person who would actually be able to fill pews. And what they're doing is actually an act of self-destruction in a sense, by driving away the very people that are, I would say, the future, particularly when you look at how many people in this country come from African backgrounds, still in the Anglican Church. Just look at Centenario in the Archbishop of York. That sort of following, that's precisely who they should be targeting, and yet they seem to be going after people who I'm pretty sure are atheists in the woke brigade. I don't know how many happy clappy tambourine shakers there are amongst the woke brigade, but I would imagine very few.
Well, this is the point, isn't it, that the Church of England is trying to be inclusive of everyone except for Christians. They don't want anybody who actually, it basically acts as if they're unashamed of the gospel. They're unashamed of gospel teachings in the way that Calvin is. He's a real solid traditional Christian, and that is explicitly the reason why they do not want him. One of the other ordinands, who also happens to have the name Robinson, one of these other ordinands has been very explicitly political, saying that the cult around Captain Tom was, I think he called it white nationalist supremacism or something like that. and he's still being ordained, and he's still getting the curacy that Calvin was denied. And you have all of these bishops, the Archbishop of Canterbury included, and sort of the remarks that he came out with about Rustat, but also about a number of other things, including the Rwanda Policy, which we'll talk about later. All of these bishops and members of the clergy are so politicised. All you have to do is go down the rabbit hole of Twitter to find these clergy and bishops, and all you have to do is even take a look at their bios. These are people who are political activists. So the idea that they would reject Calvin for being divisive, I'm so furious about this that I saw a bishop just now on the way here, and I was half-minded. I wanted to go over and say, are you proud of your colleagues for what they've done about this? Obviously I didn't, because that would be an unfair thing to do to someone just walking down the street. But that's how furious I feel, because Calvin actually was responsible for bringing me into the fold of the Church of England. And I don't want to be a part of a church that rejects someone like him, because in doing so, it's rejected everybody who holds those traditional views, myself included.
So did you count yourself as being an Anglican?
Yeah, I was very much explicitly and almost inevitably on my way to Rome, as it were, until I was derailed from that course by Calvin convincing me to spend some time within the Church of England and basically see what could be done with it. But it's quite clear from what they've done with Calvin that it's absolutely beyond saving. These are people who have absolutely no interest in Christianity whatsoever. I'm convinced that half of them are possibly even atheists. I don't really believe that many of the clergy seem to believe in God. At least they don't seem to believe in the traditional Christian understanding of God and the church. So Calvin has been hugely responsible for me not going to Rome, and now I'll probably be sort of hastened in that direction.
Well, welcome Rome. Do cross the Tiber.
I think that the church is going to see a huge hemorrhaging of Anglo-Catholics.
But this is what I find so strange and bizarre. You quoted the other Robinson, Jarrell Robinson something or other. Now this was the chap, as you said, who called the cult of Sir Tom, or Captain Tom Moore, the cult of white nationalism, right? Now this person has been given a curacy in St Botolph without Aldgate. Now, some of our viewers may know this, the famous City of London churches of Christopher Wren that were built. These were the most traditional old-fashioned churches, which usually were the epitome of the British class system. And to think that so many of them are closing now because there is nobody going to these churches. They're closing down and becoming community centres. And you have the option of somebody who could actually fill those, but instead this person who wasn't censored at all for saying something so heinously despicable, and yet Calvin, as far as I know, may be controversial, but has never said anything nasty or racist as this chap has, and yet this person has got the curacy. And then you've had other bishops saying never trust a Tory. As you said, the Archbishop of Canterbury has spoken out against Rwanda policy, against Brexit, against universal credit. That is overtly political and overtly divisive, and this is purely a case of hypocrisy.
Another aspect of this as well is that so Calvin, when he found out that his curacy was in jeopardy, did a subject access request and got the email exchanges and complaints that were being put forward by people like the Bishop of London and others, and these bishops complaining that, as you mentioned before, that he doesn't believe in systemic racism, and this was in response to him going on, say, Good Morning Britain and talking about Black Lives Matter and so on, and saying that these things are divisive, that they are racially divisive, which is what 55% of the British public, when surveyed, agreed with. And so what I find really troubling about this is the fact that these bishops, who, as I say, they are, and you mentioned, they're really politicised, that these bishops have, in a way that I think does justify, you would think if you follow the logic themselves, it would justify their resignation. Not that I ever like to call for resignations, but that now that this is out in the press and you see the Bishop of London making this horrendous comment to Calvin, that they don't seem to recognise, it's not even the irony of what they're doing. This really is a case of forgive them, Father, they know not what they do. They seem to think that in the name of anti-racism, that preventing the curacy of an ethnic minority British man is the way to preserve or to protect the church from racism. It's just absolutely mad.
And what they're saying here, Calvin has not said there was no Holocaust, right? He has said that Britain is not institutionally racist, which is what a government report came up with. This is not something beyond the pale. This is not extreme. This is what the Sewell report, a black academic himself found, and the majority of the country believes. So how they can suggest that this is somehow an extreme example of somebody from the right wing. Meanwhile, you have people like the Reverend Richard Coles, who's a left-wing vicar, tweeting out all sorts of things against the Tory party, and Father Giles, I forget his surname.
Giles Fraser.
Giles Fraser, extreme left-winger with the Moral Maze and so forth. Have they ever been censored for what they've said? Is anything that they've said less controversial? If you read some of his tweets.
Yeah, I actually read an article, an interview with Richard Coles, who's this guy who used to be in the Communards, the pop group, and he's got this kind of national treasure thing going on now, from what I can understand. He's very well known. But he was saying in this interview with Caitlin Moran that, in fact, he was being forced out of the church because the congregations were becoming more evangelical and more socially conservative. I'm sorry. I mean, the fact is it what I see, like where I live in Windsor, for example, you've got this wonderful chapel, St George's Chapel across the road, with one of the most beautiful pieces of Anglican architecture, quite small congregations. Just up the road is the theatre, the Theatre Royal. On a Sunday, it's full with what is basically evangelical Christianity services, and full of every sort of different person under the sun, age, race, whatever. So I think that basically somebody is fooling somebody else, and I think that the main problem I think with this, I'm afraid it comes down to our old friend, the Long March through the institutions. I think that it's been going on for so long. Remember, what's his name? Runcie. No, not Runcie. It was not George Carey. It was Rowan Atkinson. Rowan Atkinson. Archbishop Atkinson.
Rowan Williams.
Rowan Williams said that we should get used to elements of Sharia law. Like, that was a big deal. But there are no consequences to this. And then, of course, finally, you had the church basically not performing its role of spiritual help and guidance during the pandemic. They chose to close the churches down, and then they attacked their own choirs. So, I mean, basically, this is just all of a piece with it, isn't it?
But what the Reverend Richard Cole said was so on the money, and it's the other side of the coin of Calvin. It's the polar opposite of what happened to Calvin, and it sums up the absurdity of the situation. Reverend Cole said he wants to be a parish vicar, and he doesn't feel comfortable serving the laity because they don't reflect his views, and he doesn't reflect their views. He's out of touch because they're more conservative. So they have a priest who's leaving because they're too conservative, because he appeals more to the bishops. And then on the other side, you've got Calvin, who can't be ordained to appeal directly to those people that Richard Coles can't appeal to, and the clergy won't allow Calvin in. It is such a bizarre and stupid situation.
They seem to think that having Calvin ordained and giving him a curacy would make the congregation somehow feel uncomfortable. But actually, I know this for first hand, that there are many members, possibly even most members of Church of England congregations, who feel extremely uncomfortable with the politicisation of the clergy. And it's the two sides of this patronising argument. You first have this patronising argument of these what seem like very, very left-wing, ideological, sometimes with holding an ideology that I'd say is opposed to Christianity in many ways, ideological clergy who are patronising towards their congregation. And then you also have this incredibly racially patronising attitude that Calvin has pointed out, and it was in the interview that he did with Alison Pearson in the Telegraph, where they want to have only those ethnic minorities in posts who hold views that make them feel better about their liberal white guilt. So they are essentially using ethnic minorities as a kind of foil for their own need for repentance that should be dealt with in the traditional Christian way, not by having to surround yourself with people who only agree with you. And
it's selfish.
Yes, but
it is selfish.
What is extraordinary, though, is that where the church is actually getting stronger in places like Africa, the Anglican Church, it's super conservative. I mean, it's absolutely, a lot of the anti-gay marriage incentive came from that part of the Anglican Church a few years ago. I think the point really is what do you do? I mean, should it just be allowed to die? Should
I think
we're coming to the stage? Sorry, we're coming to the stage, aren't we, where you could make some kind of decision about the Church of England. I don't mean to be distasteful here, but when this monarch's, when the Queen's reign is over, that might be a time, mightn't it, to actually sort of let it sort of cast it adrift.
I think there's a point at which you have to, or there's a point at which many Anglicans that I know ask themselves, does the church deserve what it's going to get as a result of what they're doing? Because there seems to be such unanimity in opinion amongst the leadership of the Church of England that it does seem that actually this inevitable decline is deserved. And so you have Calvin now going to a non-affiliated Anglican church, Evangelical Catholic Church. You've had people like the Queen's former chaplain then converting to Catholicism, becoming a Catholic priest. I know of many people who are leaving the Church of England who are turning towards Catholicism or evangelical Protestantism. Yeah. So I think actually that the church has a reckoning coming, and it's very difficult to make the argument that they don't deserve it, that the leadership of the church don't deserve it. But those who don't deserve it are the congregations, the people who don't want to see their village church die, don't want to see the traditional the Anglican traditions, the tradition of the Book of Common Prayer and of the choirs and of all of the aspects of Anglican worship that are so deeply embedded in the fabric of this country and its institutions. And if you tear that fabric out and you let that fabric die, there are extreme implications of that, I think. The problem is that at the moment it does just seem like it's already a kind of corpse.
Yes, well, this is precisely the point.
It's just decaying and it's infecting the body.
You've summarised it perfectly, right? Why is the Anglican Church dying when the Catholic Church is thriving, when the evangelical churches are thriving? Yes, it's because the Catholic Church is full of young Poles, evangelical Church is full of people from Africa and so forth, but there are lots of converts coming over from the Anglican Church too, because they offer what the C of E used to offer. It's tradition, its structure, its principles.
And it takes itself seriously.
It takes itself seriously. It doesn't say whatever you want goes. It doesn't say there's more than one religion. It doesn't offer you a plethora, a smorgasbord of values. It says there are 10 commandments. This is what you follow. These are the tenets of our church. And it seems to me that if the Anglican Church doesn't get a hold of this, then it is going to die, as you say.
Yes, I mean, it's the problem is, yes, exactly, that it is embedded in our kind of culture, even just physically. I mean, down the road we've got Westminster Abbey, we've got St Paul's Cathedral. What the hell? You can't turn those into community centres.
I'm sure some of them would like to try.
Well, exactly.
Multimedia spaces.
Yes, or a multiplex cinema or something. But I mean, it is a very, very difficult. But nevertheless, you can't keep something just alive if the people at least running it don't even care about it. I mean, this is the problem. There comes a point where things actually have to take their course. Something else might come along. For example, in London, you mentioned Catholics, Polish Catholics. London's church-going has actually gone up, but it's basically immigrant church-going, whether it be from Christian Africans or Eastern Europeans or whatever. It's actually gone up. It's just they're not going to these churches. The problem with these churches is I'm reminded of do you remember when Cameron went after the kind of Hugger Hoodie and went off to the North Pole and all the rest of it to try to basically make himself liked by the Guardian reading part of society who were never going to vote Conservative. I feel the church are doing that actually with the growing sort of people who call themselves atheists. They sort of think we can somehow appeal. No. How can you appeal to...
But it's also very difficult to try and convince someone else of to join you when you believe in nothing, really. There's no... I think, like, going back to my memories of being raised in the Anglican Church, one of the reasons why I took a very long gap year from Anglicanism when I was in my late teens and early 20s was because one of the things that I found with the Anglican Church was that they failed completely to articulate why their ideas made sense. So they talk about the crucifixion, they talk about love, they talk about all these nebulous, fluffy ideas, but they would never explain to you the basis, the worldview. They held a secular worldview, and which made all of these other things make no sense. And it's only when and I never heard them once talk about anything like sin or any serious theological concepts. And without that worldview that I came to later in life through other means, without that, none of it makes any sense. And I think actually that in a way, you mentioned the buildings and St. Paul's or Westminster Cathedral, or even just the fabric of the institutional fabric of this country. It also has the problem of the Church of England having now gone even further than it was when I was a child, and actually now has become a vector for ideologies, and a vector for a particular ideology that we see in all sorts of institutions. It's more concerned with that than it is with traditional Christian teachings and with the gospel. And so, in a way, the churches themselves, Westminster Abbey, St. Paul's Cathedral, and there are exceptions to this because there are some really, really good, sound parishes, Church of England parishes, but the buildings and the institutions and all of that, it doesn't make sense anymore because the church itself as a body has been taken over as a vector for this new ideology.
Basically the culture has quite literally been hollowed out. I mean, as we've said before, the buildings are there, often beautifully kept, in fact, in better condition than they've ever been, but the people in them have changed hugely.
They're a whitewashed tomb, full of bones.
Yes, but basically you could say if you want to take over the culture from the inside, if you want, there are ways of doing it. We've seen it done so effectively, but it's gathered pace over the past 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, but although I have to say this has been going on for decades. I mean, you may remember the old BBC comedy Yes Prime Minister and Yes Minister, and in one episode Sir Humphrey says to the Prime Minister, he says, Prime Minister, we have the Bishop of Durham coming for lunch today, and the Prime Minister says, oh, is he a sound chap? He said, oh, actually he's quite a controversial maverick. He actually believes Jesus is the Son of God. And there was an element for quite a while amongst the bishops who didn't believe that Christ rose on the third day, for example, and you couldn't imagine a Catholic bishop saying anything like that, but that's a long tradition in the Anglican Church.
So while we're on the subject of our great institutions, and you touched on the Queen and what will happen after her reign, we're coming up to the Platinum Jubilee.
Yes.
So I don't know, Rafe, if you'd like to give a summary for our viewers of what sorts of things lie ahead in the next week or two.
Yes, so we're going to be marking, obviously, 70 years unparalleled. Her Majesty is about to become the second longest reigning monarch in history, just behind Louis XIV.
And he became king at what?
At a very young age.
10?
Don't question. I don't know. Don't challenge me on that. I can't.
That's not
but
really
anyway, very, very, very young. But yeah, so we're going to have a four-day-long weekend, from Trooping the Colour to pageants in pageant in the Mall to a great big Jubilee party with all sorts of names from yesterday and today, and of course street parties. I think there's something like 10% of the British population will be attending a street party, which is greater than the Golden Jubilee or the Diamond Jubilee. And street parties are very important because, in this country, unlike, say, France on July the 4th or on July 14th or America on July the 4th, we don't have an annual day to celebrate a revolution or independence. And so the disadvantage of being the world's oldest continuous democracy is that we don't have an annual celebration. So it's royal weddings, coronations, jubilees that provide those important times for social cohesion, for societies to come together, display patriotism, remind themselves why they're proud to be British. And that's why these things are important. It's not just celebrating some old lady, because the Queen is the living embodiment, not only of our Constitution, but of our Long Island story. If you can trace back to William the Conqueror, that is 1,000 years of history enshrined in the crown and embodied by the Queen. And that's why I think people need to understand it's just more than celebrating an old lady who just lived a long time.
But that's a terribly important point, actually, because, the only thing that has kept the royal family and the monarchy completely out of or at least slightly out of the culture war trenches, is the fact there's a universal admiration for her, right? But without wishing to politicise what people are doing with street parties, because they're not consciously politicised. At the same time, I'm so happy to see the amount of utterly voluntary celebration at a local level. I've been keeping kind of tabs on it. And, you know, like, for example, Hereford's got, 550 street parties. Mostly they're thicker on the ground around the southeast of England, you know, but indeed, like, you know, Oldham's got 230. Now, these are where you have road closures, so you have to actually go through the thing of going to the council to get permission and all of that. On top of that, you have all the celebrations that are happening maybe on village greens, things like that, which don't require road closures. I think in total it's something like 133,000 sort of public events like this, which is sort of approaching the Silver Jubilee. The low point was the Golden Jubilee, when it was a huge event and everyone watched on telly, but there's only pockets here and there. So I think when you think the assault on our history and the assault on the flag that has happened over the past 2 or 3 years, you know, intensively, that people still, it's almost like it has not touched them. In other words, this is going on, this madness, but they still go out because basically support for the monarchy as an institution is a value. It's not just an attitude or an opinion. They change; those things change very, very slowly. So I'm really, you know, thrilled. You're going to be doing stuff, aren't you, on GB News?
I'll be with Eamon Holmes in front of the Buckingham Palace for Trooping the Colour, and then Anne Diamond and I will be going off to South Staffordshire to cover street parties in that part of the country.
And what date for people who might want to go out and see if they can find one of these events? What day will they be
they're
happening?
all over, no, they're over a whole period. But the thing called the Big Jubilee Lunch is on the Sunday, right?
And the Trooping of the Colour and the pageant.
That's
Thursday the 2nd, and if you're lucky enough to be in London, I would say take your children or your grandchildren to the Mall for that iconic moment when the Queen hopefully will be on the balcony. You'll have a 6-minute fly past with the red arrows with the red, white and blue smoke, because your children will be able to tell their grandchildren about seeing the Queen on her 70th anniversary. Just like when I was a child, I might have met some very old person who said they had seen Queen Victoria. Now these kids will be able to tell in the next century that they had seen the Queen, and I think that's so important to providing that continuum. I once met a lady who said that she knew somebody who had Charles I sitting on the lap of King Charles I. I love those sorts of connections in history. It ties us to our national story.
Yes, I think. You know, speaking of that, you know, obviously I don't have kids or grandkids or whatever to tell, but I can tell you. And but I was at the Silver Jubilee service when I was would have been 16 in 1977, and for some reason, I think it was 50 London school kids were chosen to go, and I was one of them. Now, the Thanksgiving service, which they'll have on the Friday, this used to be the central event. Now it's been overtaken by things like pageants and things like that, but it used to be the central event. And I remember going up, and it was like a snapshot of the 1970s. I remember seeing, you know, Callaghan was there. Thatcher, leader of the opposition, was there. Archbishop Macarius was there. All of these people, and I remember the Queen in her pink outfit going, and you looked through the aisle, you know, like down the pew, as it were, you know, and you could see them all going up the aisle. And I remember, as a 16-year-old, walking out at the end of the big doors were open, onto the steps and just looking down Ludgate Hill, and to these masses of people and this sort of swirl of cheering. And, it's absolutely stayed completely with me, you know. I mean, it's an extraordinary experience, really. And so I think Rafe's absolutely right. Take your kids along, you know.
It's an invaluable slice of history.
Queen. There's a lot at stake these days, so, you know.
And what did you think of the, to take things down a notch from these elevated heights, but what did you think of the criticisms of activists who were saying that the decorations in London at the moment, with all the hanging flags, look like Nazi Germany?
Yeah,
look like doing a lot of heavy lifting there.
Yeah, the thing is that, you know, one's partly to blame for this kind of thing, because, like, I went on to GB News and talked about it, but the fact is, what you're doing really, you're just ratcheting up something that's not really there. I mean, because it was just on Twitter, a few kind of, you know, idiots saying Nazi Germany. These are people who just hate the flag, British flag, hate Britain. They can be relied upon. It's utterly ridiculous. If you go down there, It just looks stunning, on Regent Street. And they've been doing it they did it at the last Jubilee and the Jubilee before that. They did it during the Olympics. It's nothing new.
Of course, and if you go to Paris on Bastille Day, the Champs-Élysées is awash in the tricolour. You go to America on July the 4th, go to Canada on July the 1st, you go to Australia on January the 1st for Australia Day. They're all bedecked in flags. Just go and stand outside the European Parliament in Strasbourg if you want to see a proper demonstration of fascist order. There's this great line of blue flags are there in martial splendour going down the entire... My hand shouldn't be rising up like that, should it?
Probably the same people who would be waving the European flag at the proms.
Well, yeah, a lot of them were, because there was just a contingent of Remainers who basically anything but Britain, and they're the people who went around with this, what I think is a corporate logo painted on their face, bedecked in flags, Middle England, actually, the new Middle England, and yet they kind of, carry on because of Union Jack, which, let's face it, I mean, it's not really, Rafe said, it's not even really seen very much here. But I mean, frankly,
If anything, the Union Jack is the symbol of actual anti-fascism.
Yes, this is why it's so vile to equate the Union flag with the Nazi symbology, because we were the ones who defeated fascism. People in Europe were crying tears of joy when they saw the British flag coming down, because they knew that salvation was there. And let's not forget also, it was the British flag that has actually advanced the world more than any other civilization. The world we live in today was a British creation. Modernity is a British creation. We shone the light of civilization into the darkest corners of the planet.
I've got many European friends who when I have asked them explicitly about this, and they say that they view Britain, they view the symbolism of Britain as being the symbolism of liberation, because we liberated Europe. And I was only just this week I was in Oslo in Norway, and I was walking around. They have lots of sort of English pubs. They're not quite, but they're doing something similar, and they call them a public house or a pub. And one of them was Winston Churchill's public house. And we're still so admired around Europe for that period of time.
Come right up to date. The Ukrainians, for goodness sake, when they put,
Boris Johnson Square or whatever it was.
Exactly. They say "God save the Queen" as they're about to fire. They do apparently. They love us, and it's absolutely true what you say. It's just that there has been a group of people who maybe 50, 60, 70 years ago were quite small, that George Orwell spoke about, and wrote about, but they have kind of grown exponentially. They're not just an intelligentsia anymore, they're a kind of lumpen intelligentsia.
And what do you think of, what do you think Meghan Markle and Harry... Meghan Markle. What do you think Meghan and Harry are going to be doing in the next couple of weeks to try and draw the attention back to themselves?
I hope she's at her father's bedside in California looking after him, as he had a stroke on Monday. But I suspect she hasn't shown any interest in him so far. So she still seems set to come over to the UK. The Queen has barred them from going onto the balcony at Buckingham Palace, quite rightly too. But they are going to have their ghastly Netflix camera crew coming with them to make this documentary. They're not allowed to film on royal property on the royal estates, but there's nothing stopping them from taking the cameras right up to the gates. And I think there's a real risk of the Harry and Meghan circus overshadowing the Platinum Jubilee, because the tabloids will invariably be focusing on them so much. And I just hope that they don't knock the Queen off of the front pages, because it would be so terrible if that were the case.
Do you know what? I've got a feeling not, because just to go back to what I was saying about street parties earlier, is that with all these things that have been happening, and there was Tina Brown's book, the Palace Papers, there's going to be Harry's memoir, The Age of God knows what, and all of this. Despite all that, people have gone ahead and sort of decided to celebrate. And the general feeling one gets about it is one of excitement, So perhaps it's not going to be this annus horribilis that people are worried about. Maybe real fundamental values and loyalties will reassert themselves in this instance.
But even just simply doing the Netflix documentary and filming during the Jubilee, they are using the Jubilee celebration and their trip here to concoct some of that for them.
Harry and Meghan's celebrity is based exclusively upon their royal status and their access, their proximity to the crown. And living in California, that status is ebbing away from them day by day. They're becoming more
So they
and
need
more
to
irrelevant.
come back to the
Bit like
watering
Harry's
hole.
hair,
They
yeah.
have to come back to in order to be seen to be relevant. This is the irony, you know.
Bitchy, Peter. Bitchy.
But they didn't get invited to the Academy Awards. They didn't get invited to Obama's 60th birthday. They're not actually quite as relevant or important as they think they are. Netflix is getting hugely bored by them. No one cares about the Invictus Games. Everyone's being so nicey about it, but no one gives two hoots about this. They know that. They can't seem to produce anything of quality. Now they want to produce, Harry and Meghan have suggested, this behind the scenes, have a look at us at home. Irony of irony, the two people who are asking more for their privacy to be respected are now having cameras inside their homes to film that. But, you know, if Netflix don't get to have access to Palace Live, there's not going to be much to report on.
So before we move on to talking about the Rwanda immigration policy and the migration statistics that will be coming out tomorrow on the time of filming, shall we have a quick chat about this Peter Hitchens piece that he wrote in the Daily Mail about striving for English independence?
Yeah, it's very interesting from Peter, because obviously he's been on this channel a lot. When I last spoke to him on the channel a few months ago now, I did sort of say to him, well, his prognosis about Britain is always very, very, always very, very bad. That the game is up, and he's just the obituary writer and all of that. But I just sort of said, what if it were just England we're talking about? And then he sort of perked up, I remember, and said, oh, well, that's quite interesting then. This article that you're referring to was in the Mail on Sunday, I believe, and it was basically talking about what could happen if England, on its own, no Scotland, no Wales, Ireland. And he seemed, for Peter, sort of quite hopeful about what it might mean, and that a lot of it was based on so many things that were supposedly British actually being English, and the sense still of an English kind of identity, and it starts to become quite interesting to ponder, So in other words, instead of just looking at the sort of devolution debate as being something which is just negative, just let them go if they want to and all of that, this was sort of more of a positive thing, like actually, perhaps, we could actually really, clear some things up. We could actually build new things on a very strong basis of English identity that's been there for 1,000 years.
What do you think, Rafe, of the idea of English independence?
Well, it's a very attractive one. I've been speaking about the growing discontent in England and why the governments need to address the injustice that's been done to England by too much devolution to the other countries in the Union, by too much transfers of money per capita, all these different things. For about 20 years I've been talking about this, and in 2007 I wrote an article which you can find on Google called The Importance of Being English. I've always said Britain is the world's second greatest creation, because the greatest creation was England. And the thing is, when you think about Britain, in effect you're thinking about England, because all of the values, all of the images of Britain are actually English. The common law, the rule of law, parliamentary democracy, the monarchy, the English language, obviously. Even the landscape for most people is more English than it is Scottish or Welsh. It's England that has created Britain. And the thing is, the largest power within any union never seems to mind to offer up and have its national identity woven into this greater union fabric. So if you look at Yugoslavia, it's the Serbs will always say that they're Yugoslav. You wouldn't find the Croatians or the Bosnians saying they were Yugoslav. They would say that they're Croatian or Bosnians. If you look at Germany, the Prussians would always say that they're German. But if you're from Bavaria, more likely to say that you're Bavarian. So if you're in America, if you're from the South, you're from Dixie first. If you're in Canada, if you're from Ontario, the biggest province, you're Ontarian. But if you're from British Columbia, you're British Columbian. And the same thing in this country. The English were always the ones, apart from Ulstermen, who always said they were British first, but the Scots would always say they're Scots first. The Welsh would say they're Welsh first. The English, until about 15, 20 years ago, would say that they were British first. Now that's changed, because what have they seen? They've seen the fact that these small regions of the country felt threatened by England, so they've preserved their national culture. And they've somehow managed to forget about their role in empire. Anything to do with the empire, the Scots were at the forefront, was an English creation, an English sin. All of the bad things of Britain are English, all the best things, all of this Celtic dancing and all the rest of it is part of their culture and identity. And the English, for too long, have been scared of an overt patriotism. The English never wanted to demonstrate their patriotism. So for them, it was a bicycling vicar. It was warm beer, it was Morris dancers. And the English need to reclaim their true national identity and symbols and values, which is democracy, the rule of law, and all of these things. And I think it's time for the English to do that. I'm still a unionist, but I would like to see much more delegation of powers to England. I want to see not an English parliament, but maybe having only English MPs voting on English legislation. It's not fair that under Labour, Scottish MPs could vote on English education. All of these things need to be addressed because England is the senior partner, and yet it's been completely neglected for so long that the resentment is coming to the point where, yes, the English may be the ones to actually instigate independence, because you can see already that they're very happy to see Scotland go. And I've got many Scottish unionist friends who believe proudly in Britain, and I wouldn't want to see them lose their place within our union.
Well, no, I mean, would you call yourself British or English?
I call myself British because I still regard English as an ethnic identity. Britishness was a solution to uniting England and Scotland. Being Scots was an ethnic identity, being English is an ethnic identity, and so is Welsh. And Britishness was a construct of the 18th century to unite peoples together under a transnational notion of Britishness. And that expanded beyond there. You had this notion of a Greater Britain under the Empire. The crown was indivisible, so whether you were from Sydney, Australia, Auckland, New Zealand, Cape Town, South Africa, Montreal in Canada, or from Glasgow or from London, you were all equally British under the crown. There was no distinction. There was no single citizenship until 1947 when Canada created its own citizenship. Everybody was just a British citizen. And that was the first time since the Roman Empire you had a transnational, non-ethnically based identity. Englishness, my earliest English ancestor was King Edward III's daughter Isabella, which is the 1300s. So it'd be a bit rich for me to say that I'm English, but I'm British. The issue comes if we do separate as an English kingdom separate to the UK, then I'd have to become English because I'd have an English passport. But right now I have a British passport. I live in England, but I'm British. But only if England became independent, you would have to have an Englishness as your identity, because England then becomes the state.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't have a problem with that. But, I mean, I'm, you know, as you were saying, I remember my parents sort of, for example, just unconsciously stopped. They didn't call themselves British anymore. They called themselves English. And I think you have to say, well, why would they do that? This happened in the 90s, actually, and then into the noughties. And I think it's because they were trying to hold on to something. You know, if anyone can be British, then basically nothing is British. And they felt sort of under attack, because indeed they were under attack. So they started calling themselves English. I say English now. I put it on forms. You know,
I've always thought of myself as English. I've never thought of myself as British. I don't think in response to that question, unless I maybe speaking to Americans or in a certain context abroad, maybe I might describe myself as being British.
No, but they interestingly, Americans always talk about England.
But I can't remember ever.
But your roots are English, though, right?
Yeah.
That's my point. That's what I'm trying to explain, right? My roots aren't English. As I said, Edward III's daughter is a long, long time ago. That's my earliest English ancestor. I have some Stuart family connections in Scotland, but that again is from the 1700s. So that's why I don't.
Yeah, but there's nothing to mean that you could not be an English citizen. I mean,
no, but that's my point. Now I'm British, but if England were to separate, then England would become the state, and you would have an English passport, and you would have English citizenship. But right now we have British citizenship, and being English to me is an ethnic identity. And that's controversial because a lot of people think, well, what are, the black footballers are in Scotland being... But no, for me, that's how I prefer to... And actually, you'll find a lot of ethnic minorities from the Commonwealth have that view. They're the ones who will say now that they're British because they're not comfortable saying that they're English.
So you wouldn't be comfortable calling yourself English then?
I just don't think it's correct.
No.
I regard...
Do you?
Do I think that Rafe is English, or do I?
No, do you think that... no, because this is something that when we talk about these issues, quite often people say, oh, you skirt around these sort of things. So, I mean, do you think English is an ethnic identity?
I don't think it's an ethnic identity. I think it's a separate cultural identity from British. And I think with all cultures, there's always an ethnic component because everything comes from somewhere. So there's a historical ethnic component to it. And probably most people who would call themselves English, I imagine, will be of a particular ethnicity. But I think it's more of a separate cultural identity. And this is what goes to the heart of what you were saying about the Scots. And I noticed this actually, I felt quite jealous when I was at this conference in Norway that all of the Scandinavian people were represented there, and the Swedes and the Norwegians, they were wearing cultural dress. And I sort of sat down for a minute feeling a little sad, and then realised it was because I was thinking, I don't have a culture. I was wearing a tartan dress because that was the best I could muster.
Yes, but I wouldn't worry too much about that. I wouldn't worry about not having a dress.
We do. The whole world has engaged in English cultural appropriation by wearing the suit.
Yes,
This is our contribution to the world.
Yeah.
In Japan, the suit is called the saburo, which is Savile Row. That is their word for suit. So I'm culturally, now, but to get to your point, I'm culturally English. I think I know more patriotic quotes and poems, and I can recite you Churchill for an hour and a half than anybody that I've ever met. So when it comes to English culture, you'll be hard-pressed to find somebody more English, more plugged in from carry-on films to Shakespeare than me. But I still don't think of myself ethnically as English.
So I think it's deeply cultural rather than it being an ethnic.
Yeah, I think the hatred of England, not just by Scottish nationalists and Welsh nationalists, but by our friends who don't like flags, for example, that is based, I think that's based on what they think of England, which is essentially, basically, you're talking about, say, like a white majority.
Yeah.
That's why they so particularly, who was it? I can't remember. It takes nothing. Remember Jon Snow? I've never seen so many white people during Brexit. For the kind of left, all it takes is a group of young white guys, to be together in England, and they think fascist immediately, in a way that they don't think of any other
They're
group.
far more ethnically minded or racially minded than those who like the flag. Because
they are about everything, but particularly in this case. So I think all I would say is that when Peter wrote this article, I did have a kind of a kind of sudden moment of real kind of optimism and hope. Just really, I could feel it go through, and I thought, actually, that's really true. Maybe we've got to, start afresh, but it's not that, is it? But actually go back to our strengths,
I don't want to be a downer by asking it's not a critical question as such, but don't you think that England, as much as I like the sentiment of Peter's article, and I like the patriotism, and I agree with the assessment of England and England's institutions and its landscape and so on, but don't you think that we as a nation would be diminished internationally if we were to become England rather than Great Britain, and that we would lose something by losing the other members of the United Kingdom?
Yes and no. Yes, I think our big power status would be diminished. Most importantly, we would lose all of our nuclear deterrence because all of our nuclear submarines are in Scotland.
Because this has
But at the
geopolitical
same time,
implications.
we are subsidising the Scots and the Welsh and the Irish because the southeast of England is the most prosperous part of Europe. There's more money generated in the southeast of England, and yet, of course, the north of England and elsewhere are some of the most poor areas of northern Europe. But so and people forget, London is bigger than Scotland and Wales combined. But there's also natural resources and everything else. But I think England could make a go of itself. But yes, but this is it. I just think historically and culturally, I would lament the death of the United Kingdom. But we've got to this point now where this is all Tony Blair's fault. Last 2 weeks ago we did a thing about Tony Blair. I neglected to mention, because time was going on, his role in devolution. Because Scotland has now become the wokest place in Europe, arguably, right? And that's fueled this sense of disconnect between the Scots and the English. This is all thanks to Tony Blair, because there had never been a really huge nationalist movement in Scotland. He forced this idea of a referendum for devolution. In Wales, there had never been a nationalist movement. Then they had a referendum on whether to have devolution, and it was something like 49.5 to 50.5. There was no great appetite. Since devolution in those places, There's been a huge surge in nationalism in all of those regions. So if the UK does break up, it's because of the fact of Tony Blair's devolution and the political ideology dominant now in Scotland and in Wales, which is far more woke than in England, has been facilitated by devolution and by Tony Blair.
Although he did it, he did it as a way of stemming the tide, he thought, of nationalism. Totally...
Classic Blair, backfiring
yes,
badly.
Sort of, exactly.
But don't you think that given the situation with Russia and with China, given actually the fact that, as we've seen over Ukraine, Britain has shown itself to be at the forefront again of political world events in a way that Britain is famous for being on the right side of these things and being early to the fight.
Yes, but
that actually we would be.
England?
But would we?
England? I mean, the thing is our response to the pandemic, which we were for a moment the freest country actually, weren't we, during the pandemic at one point? That was England. That certainly wasn't Scotland or Wales.
And it's very much the Tory party who's taken this stance on the Ukraine and on foreign affairs and global Britain and so forth. And what I find interesting, and I'd never heard anyone comment on this, is there was always a very strong Scottish presence in cabinet. The last time was under the Labour Party, but of course the Tory party wiped out in Scotland. So what used to happen was the quality candidates from Scotland became MPs in London, and all of the has-beens and the useless ones went to the Scottish Parliament. So the Scottish Parliament was full of the second-rate politicians. But now they have no place in the cabinet in Britain, and they're up in Scotland. And I think that's also leading to this sort of devolution disconnect, because Scots don't see themselves represented at all for the last 15 years in the government.
Unfortunately, we've only got a short time left and we've got a very big topic to cover. So shall we move on to the Rwanda policy?
Yes,
because this week it's been in the news that apparently the plan was only ever to send 300 people a year to Rwanda, and given that the statistics have got them here, so until this point this year, we've already had more than 7,300 arrive across the channel. The projections are for nearly 60,000 people to cross this year. So the idea that this policy was only ever intending to send 300 people to Rwanda as a way of somehow alleviating the pressure on the asylum process and deterring people from crossing the channel. It just seems absurd now that the suggestion was that this would break the models of the human traffickers on the other side of the channel if it's only going to be 300 people.
No, it is pathetic. In fact, there was tweeted today, there's some sign put out saying 16 have gone back. Is it 16 have gone back today or something like that? It's pathetic. But I've always said all the way along, I'm sorry, when this Rwanda thing was announced, my attitude has always been there is no real will to fix this, and there will be so many challenges to this. You could almost hear them kind of lining up, the human rights
shuffling
lawyers, all
feet,
the NGOs, all of this. And every obstacle will be put in its way, and I think that will still be the case. But above and beyond that, I think that the actual central government, I don't think that there is the real will to do anything about it. And whether we're talking about illegal crossings or not is in a way sort of another point. It's immaterial because it's the actual sheer scale of the immigration that's happening anyway. Which is a bigger topic maybe for another time. But that is one of the terrible failures of Brexit, in the sense that there is not the will. The apparatus was put there, in every way, but there's not been the will to actually follow through. And people thought that they were taking back their control of their borders. And what has happened is that immigration is, I think, possibly in 2021, the highest ever. And frankly, it is. I mean, it's shocking and it's a betrayal.
The Rwanda scheme is a farce. I knew it was going to be a farce. I said it at the time. The idea in principle is great. I've said for, 10, 15 years, we have all of these British overseas territories, St. Helena, the Ascension Islands, unpopulated. We should be putting all asylum seekers onto one of our own British overseas territories, having processing camps there. And if you're stuck in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean with the wind howling in, it's going to be a far less attractive thing than to get processed in either Rwanda or the UK. But the reality is this government never had any intention of seriously coming to terms with asylum seekers or with immigration. All it does is it talks the talk. And unfortunately, a lot of the British public think things are happening because they see the headlines and they see these statements. But whether it's pushing the boats back in the channel or whether it's Rwanda, these are all, in my view, simply dead cat schemes to divert attention away from Partygate and from the government's other failings. Let's throw a bit of red meat to the red wall. Let's hope they don't look too deeply. People are too busy with their lives to actually analyse what's going on. 300 a day, when you have 300 a year, when you have that many coming over per day, is an absolute farce. But as you said quite correctly, all of the attention of the media on asylum seekers coming on the channel is, I think, a distraction from the bigger issue. We have a few thousand coming on the channel. We have hundreds of thousands coming over. As I've said in my lecture there, we've had more immigrants in the last 25 years arriving in this country than in the last 2,000 years combined. The Ugandan immigrants who came in, 27,000, famously under with Idi Amin expulsion in the 70s, we get that every 2 weeks. No country can survive such large numbers of immigrants coming over. And I think the healthiest that America ever was between 1920 and 1960, when it had almost no immigration. They had huge immigration before that period, and that 40-year break gave the country time to absorb the immigrants who had been there, and you had harmony. You had the most progressive economy in the world at the time. You didn't have any racial strife, any city strife. That was the golden era, and I think Britain would benefit from calling a halt to almost all immigration for 20, 40, 50 years. Unfortunately, there's absolutely no way that's going to be possible in this country when actually the majority of this country is not conservative. The conservatives, people who vote right-wing are only about 35% of the population. It's just that the left are divided between Labour, Green, SNP, so forth.
But the SDP has actually got this, hasn't it? I mean, the SDP is a thing, right? But probably a lot of people don't know it's around, but it does have a moratorium on immigration for about 20 years as one of its policies, which was actually really radical. I remember that in the early days of UKIP, that was also a policy, you know, that somehow things are so badly askew, the immigration front, that in fact we've just simply got to, you know, take a breather. I think UKIP, we should say 5 years, which is, you know, the SDP are being far more radical about it. But the problem is that all the polls now, as you say, show that people have kind of lessened in their concern about it because they sort of think that it's being dealt with. But in fact, it's absolutely not. What was the statistic came out this week? 6.4 million people now on the NHS waiting list. Who mentions anything to do with immigration on who? For goodness sake, we have to talk about this, or the housing problem. We have to talk about this all the time with no recourse to talking about immigration. It's like trying to argue with one hand tied behind your back. You know, it is utterly ridiculous.
As a side to that, did you see also this week that that the news that the NHS will be offering free sex change surgery? Whilst they do have a waiting list that is as long as that. People are very, very rightly angry, I think, that you have cancer patients who can't get treatment and they're offering surgery for sex change as it seems to be some kind of priority.
The NHS, you've seen, rather like the church we began talking about, has become hugely politicised, actually. So, for example, slightly connected to immigration in a different way, but with health tourism, you know, which became a big issue a few years ago, up to 2 billion, I think, or something, lost in health tourism. The reason that no government could actually really deal with that is that a lot of people in the health service themselves wouldn't administer it. They
it's the same as the border force refusing to push the boats back.
They sort of think, well, so what? You know, we can handle it. So what? You know, we should do that. Well, actually, it's not. It's a national health service.
It shows an undemocratic attitude overall within these institutions.
What it means is that whatever a government actually feels, it is going to be basically, you know, stymied by the individual activism of all these institutions. And beforehand, it might have just been economic ones. Now it is all of these sort of institutions.
I think on that note, we're actually going to have to wrap up, but
Yeah.
I am sure that we will return to the subject of the Rwanda plan and migration in the coming weeks, particularly because by the time of our next show, we will have those migration statistics as well. So thank you, Peter. Thank you, Rafe. And thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. Put your comment below to let us know what you think of the show and our topics. And we will see you next time on Newspeak.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.